I've covered quite a few stories about things that could have been, but never happened. Big parking garages, under-river subways, street extensions, island parks. But had any of these projects actually become realities in later years, they wouldn't necessarily stand out, especially to an outside visitor to the city. But a plan, promoted by a man named Max Loeb, would have been something else entirely. And had this plan come to fruition, it would have created something that, even generations later, would have stood out to anyone, local or visitor. This is the story of the Max Loeb Memorial Park. That never happened. With a career working in the shoe business dating back into the late 1870s by his own account, Max Loeb made his connections, including a long-term relationship with the proprietors of Meyer and Frank. He would transition into a career as a businessman, heavily involved in the real estate business. Most information you'll find about the man during the 1910s ties into land deals he was involved in. With these ties to land, Loeb not only saw it as a business, but something he was deeply passionate about. So passionate that he hated to see a good chunk of land go unused or unappreciated. He had a particular affinity for a few acres up on the top of a hill to the south and above downtown Portland, Oregon. This land had been donated by Sylvester Penoyer and his family back in 1894, with the stipulation that the land only be used as a park, preferably for women and children. Penoyer by this time was finishing up his second term as the governor of Oregon, but he had ties to Portland dating back into the 1850s, and after his tenure as governor, he would become the mayor of Portland in 1896. This land given to the city was originally named Penoyer Park, but would later be changed to Governor's Park, still referencing the former governor. While not one to command headlines before, in March 1925, Max Loeb spoke in reverence of a recently passed fellow businessman, John Vestal, who donated his estate to Portland School District. A few years later, in 1929, a new school would be built in Vestal's name on 82nd Avenue and Davis Street in Northeast Portland. Loeb lauded Vestal for his wonderful gift to the city and hoped it would inspire similar gifts from others in the future to the local citizens' benefit. But he also questioned why anyone would do such a thing in relation to things like the land that Sylvester Penoyer gifted to the city. By 1925, he'd gifted this land more than 30 years earlier, and since then little had been done to maintain the land. It was hardly a park at all. Locals had petitioned the city more than once to clean up and maintain the park, but none of these petitions even made it to the city council. Funny thing is, local Girl Scouts seem to be getting more work done up on that park than the city was. In an article on this matter, Loeb would say, "There ought to be more gifts to the public. Religion, politics, and other considerations should not enter into the accepting or administration of gifts. It is a disgrace and a condemnation that the public does not show more appreciation and in a more practical way." So this guy was really invested in land, and in making the best use of it possible. And he was making a point to tie in Governor's Park in all of this, which would come back into play later. Today, Governor's Park is still relatively obscure, at least in regards to other parks in town. If you're not a local up in the hills or just someone who really knows your Portland parks, many people probably don't even know this park exists. But it does. It's a thin stretch of green space, lined with trees with an entrance on Davenport Street. Today, this area is mostly narrow, winding streets up into the hills, leading to a vast variety of expensive homes. To the north, I-405 at the bottom of the hill and downtown beyond that. To the south, the OHSU campus and the Markham Nature Park. And just downhill from, well, this hill is also the famous Peugeot's Castle. The area is all residential. But if you go back far enough, most of this was undeveloped land. After taking the city to task for not appreciating its gifts back in 1925, Loeb was back at it again a couple years later. In December 1929, only weeks into the start of the Great Depression, he called out the city for neglecting those park acres donated by former Governor and Mayor Pennoyer. Since the start of the 1900s, Portland had prided itself as a city that developed and took care of its parks, and yet, even by the end of the 20s, Governor's Park was sitting up there like an ugly duckling. Loeb criticized the park's circumstances, with its overgrown grass making it a fire trap, as well as a nice little hideout for criminals on the run or those looking for a place in the hills to hide. He wanted something done. And not just in that park, but all around it. And that's where the focus of our story really takes off. On July 6, 1930, Max Loeb made an official announcement that he wanted to create a complex up in the hills there just south of downtown and right in the vicinity of Governor's Park. His hope was that this place could be a memorial park that not only would make use of this undeveloped land, but also create a feast for the visual sense from even miles away. Those on the east side of the river could look across and up to the top of the hill and see this place clearly. It would be visible from several locations throughout downtown. There were endless possibilities, and to show that he wasn't just throwing casual ideas around, Loeb had an artist rendering produced of what such a place might look like. While this was not a detailed representation of a finalized product, Loeb said it gave an indication of the dignity, grandeur, and monumental character that such a development might express. This initial representation, of which there would be more than one, was from an aerial perspective looking generally in a southern direction. In it, we can see a collection of buildings and structures along the winding roads leading up the hill. But the most captivating element of the whole project were the towers projected to be located at the very top of the hill. With the drawing clearly not to scale, the towers look monstrous in comparison to everything else. This was not going to just be a small park or a little memorial at the end of a winding cul-de-sac. This was going to be the size of a small neighborhood. From a memorial sense, Loeb expressed that the park could be a monument to Oregon's prosperity and civic pride. The land was, again, mostly undeveloped and thus potentially available, and the area was accessible from all sides. I know some may look back at this from today, seeing the city how it looks now, and think this is a pretty crazy idea. But that's really what I love about it. I love that people would shoot for the stars like this. Altogether, as of the summer of 1930, it was said this park would include a recreational center for use by individuals as well as patriotic and service societies, an educational center, a peace memorial, an aquarium, a manufacturing building, a transportation building, and the Pièce de Résistance, 3 museum buildings that would make up those 3 towers at the top of the hill. It was almost like a mini Lewis and Clark exposition, except instead of being to the north and down by the lake, it would be to the south and tower up into the hills. By this time, Max Loeb was a well-respected local citizen, and the city was quick to take his idea very seriously. The city's planning commission put the pressure on the city council to not sell off any lots they owned in this vicinity, of which they already owned 66 of them. According to a later report published in 1933, most of this land obtained by the city was obtained after the previous owners had not paid their taxes on it. Civic organizations got behind the thing. Come September 1930, the city's Chamber of Commerce threw their support behind it. An organization calling itself the Statewide Memorial Park Association was founded to carry out the work on this venture, and yet, in the future, they were seldom ever referenced. It was one of those projects that was becoming a done deal, perhaps just a little too fast. Like I said earlier, I loved that people shot for the stars like this, but sometimes when you get a little too carried away by your own creation, the path to achieving it can get a little rough. We must recall we were in the early stages of the Great Depression here, and many people were tightening up on their finances, if they had much financially at all. And Loeb's idea as to how to fund this, which would have cost $300,000 alone just buying up all the necessary land, was to start by having local kids and groups go around essentially peddling for money. And once these initial funds were raised, they would turn to the more, quote, wealthy persons to complete things. And after this $300,000, or more than $5.5 million in today's money, was raised, there was still all the money that would have to be raised to construct everything in the park, including its roads. Loeb would be quoted to say on the financial matter, "We don't want large contributions, just small amounts from the great mass of the people." He made a point that even at $300,000, with all of the lots involved, the land was actually going for less than it should have. The implication under circumstances such as this was always to act now because the costs were only going to go up. The inference is that at least efforts to raise the money took off rather quickly, but perhaps not all that successfully. On November 22, 1930, about 4.5 months after the first announcement of the project, Max Loeb published his own piece in local papers. In it, he delved further into the project and what it would consist of. And certainly with a couple months to mull it over, new ideas or alterations had come to mind. Beyond becoming arguably the most famous park in the whole city, with beautiful views all around, it would also be a rest area, but without the annoyances that could come with such a place. Need I reference back to my video about the segregated plaza blocks in downtown Portland? At this same time, 1930, one of those blocks had been designated no men, just so that local women would have a place to rest and not be hassled by loitering mashers. So having a rest area without annoyances did make a lot of sense. A Greek-themed theater was planned to be built there that could hold 20,000 people for live events, such as plays and concerts. A Vista House would be created, a possible spot to hold educational classes for children. A large convention hall would also be erected with enough space for any kind of exhibit imaginable. Another large building could be erected that could be used as a local farmer's market. And to correlate with that, there would be the manufacturing building, where local manufacturers could sell their goods. And Loeb even saw the location as having applicable use come Rose Festival time in the late spring. Loeb even suggested the park could be used as the site for the crowning of the Rose Festival queen. Beyond simply being a captivating park space, there were economic benefits to be had here as well. Again, a benefit in the early days of the Depression. But it was big, and it was getting bigger. And with that, it was becoming a more expensive proposition to get people behind and more time-consuming. Everyone understood that this whole thing was not going to be built overnight, especially since, at this point, the only guidance any architects would have was the drawings of how the place might look. And then a year passed, with not much progress. That might have been fine. Again, everyone knew this was going to take time, but the city was starting to get the feeling that Loeb was maybe dragging his heels a little bit. The problem with that was the city was holding up their end by not selling off any of these many lots they possessed. They continued sitting on them, and wondering if it was going to be worth it when all was said and done. This culminated in a November 1931 ultimatum given to Loeb by the city council. Get this project going in the next 6 months, or we're going to start putting these lots up for sale. And even if just a few of these lots sold, it would have created just another obstruction to this park becoming a reality. Despite the Depression being well underway at this point, this was appealing property up in the hills, and numerous offers had been made to the city to buy some of these lots, all of which they'd turned down in the hopes that this place would become something magical. But they couldn't hold back forever. Max Loeb did about what you might expect under these circumstances. He first asked the city to give him an option on all of these properties they were holding on to. A pretty ballsy move at the time, but beyond that, he assured the city council he was just about ready to finally get started on this project's organization, which would then move it forward. Whether he was telling the truth or not, what else would you expect him to say? This was his dream, cultivated arguably as far back as the mid-1920s, and he surely did not want to see it slip away. This ultimatum gave him until May 15, 1932, to make a splash. This clearly lit a fire under the man, as in the year prior to this ultimatum, there were practically no updates on the progress of this venture, suggesting not much was happening. But then suddenly the project was in the papers again. Only weeks after meeting with the city council, Loeb got the project endorsed by the East Side Commercial Club. In those early months of 1932, Max Loeb was hustling, giving presentations to anyone who took an interest. With no financial updates at this time, I get the feeling he was still struggling to get that money together for the land purchases, so perhaps by getting more endorsements from local organizations, that might help compensate for the lack of money. All of this work culminated in a massive meeting held on May 3, 1915, less than 2 weeks before Loeb's deadline to show the city some results. Members of more than 20 local organizations gathered for this event, and probably to Loeb's great relief, they all voted unanimously to have a study conducted by a committee to determine the feasibility of this project. It wasn't a yes, it's happening, but it was a small step forward, and it might have bought Loeb more time. And I think that's just what happened, as May 15th came and went without so much as an update in terms of where the city stood on these properties they'd been holding back, or where they stood with Max Loeb in general. This committee that was established would work on the matter into the summer months to investigate the project's potential. At this point, the cost of obtaining the land was estimated to be between $250,000 and $350,000, not all too different from previous projections. The possibility was also suggested that this memorial park could be made into a state park, wherein the state would share in some of the costs and maintenance. And while at this point only a few drawings had been done outlining what the park could look like, with this committee forming, an actual model of what the park might have looked like was created by a man named Lawrence Holford of the local architectural firm of Allen and Bean. He would name the model Acropolis of the Pacific. This model was probably the closest representation that would ever be created as to what this park would have looked like, and in many aspects it was quite the departure from the earlier drawings. The 1930 drawing was very dramatic and presented lofty possibilities with numerous structures along the hillside and an almost Colosseum-like outdoor venue just below 3 great towers staring down upon the city like gods. The model was a bit more subdued, but also far more realistic and practical. This is not to say it did not have lofty elements itself. It had a massive collection of buildings at the top, with a spire-like tower to one end and a more octagon-domed tower to the other. And the outdoor theater space was still just beneath that. But then there were several roads running all around, with a couple tunnels, and notably a large bridge coming in from the south. And even just having a 3-dimensional representation of what this thing could be had to help put things into better perspective. The likes of John Charles Olmsted and Edward Bennett were also called back on, even though they hadn't had an effect on the city in a few decades. Both referenced a time or two in past videos of mine, Olmsted created a park plan for the city and presented it at the start of 1904. Then, in 1912, Bennett created a full plan for Portland's future at a time where it was presumed the city would hit 2 million people one day, and not too far into the future. His plan also called for numerous parks around town. And Portland's reputation with their parks had been something of a mixed bag since then. But turning this hillside into a large memorial park would go a long way towards helping that reputation, if nothing more than at least providing more park acreage to the city. A picture of this model was published in a December 1932 edition of the Sunday Oregonian, suggesting the project was still very much alive at the end of the year, and more than a year after the city had given Max Loeb that ultimatum. In March 1933, a report would be released by city engineer Olaf Largaard and city attorney Frank S. Grant, outlining the proposed park idea with a focus on the location and construction of the roads that would run up the hill into what was then being referred to as the Loeb Memorial Park and Civic Emergency Center. A key issue they noted was the establishing of right-of-ways connecting with surrounding existing routes, which would have required another couple $100,000 to deal with. In response to this, Loeb assured everyone that his company would take care of at least 4 of these right-of-ways personally. And this may have been necessary on his part, as the report also noted that they did not see it as likely that the road situation could be handled via a self-liquidating process, or essentially a project that would pay for itself through funds generated by that project. The implication here was that funding would likely need to be obtained through some relief program. And, once again, the project stalemated for a while. but would still hold on into the following year, 1934. Loeb continued hustling and trying to get more organizations behind the project, one of which was the Oregon Building Commission. This organization would pen a letter to Julius Meyer, son of one of the founders of the Meyer and Frank department store, a store which Loeb had past connections to. Julius Meyer would even take over this store at one point. But at this time, Julius Meyer was the governor of Oregon, and in this letter to him, F.H. Murphy, who wrote it, stated, "It is doubtful if any other major city has such a sightly and promising location for a park, and it is certain that such an opportunity near Los Angeles or San Francisco would be fully exploited and advertised to the world." Throwing in the two largest cities on the West Coast, there seemed to be an element of, well, any real West Coast city would do this, to this letter. Governor Meyer was also known for his progressive actions while governing the state of Oregon through the harshest period of the Great Depression. Supporting a massive memorial park that was commemorating the state itself and giving work to those constructing it might have struck a chord with the governor. Murphy addressed this element directly in referring to relief funds that had been put to use since the Depression had started. Specifically, he wrote, "If the desire to utilize this opportunity which lies at our door could be crystallized into some definite organized effort, we believe some of the funds now being spent for relief work could be utilized in improving this district just as well as any other. This would benefit the community and help bring the time nearer when the hope of Mr. Loeb might be realized." This seems to infer further that the method of gathering funds that Loeb had initially pursued had not gone well, and now the hope was that some Depression relief money could be used to compensate for that. U.S. Senator Charles McNary, who would be a key supporter in President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal programs, told Loeb personally that he would pursue obtaining federal funds for this project. And while some fairly big players were still getting involved and supporting this park idea that had been first announced some 4 years earlier, the large model produced to represent what the park would look like was also making the rounds, clearly in an effort to catch the eye of local residents and keep the whole thing relevant. In August of 1934, it made its way into one of the most popular spots in town for exposure, the Portland Hotel. Then, come October, some more rough news. Months after the city engineer report on the roads to be constructed with this park, they determined that the cost of the road work alone would be almost $435,000 just for the road work. Much of this money would have covered the cost of labor. It was suggested that Reconstruction Finance Corporation, or RFC funds, could be used to help cover the construction costs. The RFC was established by the federal government in 1932 and with a focus in restabilizing the economy and in banks. They also provided relief funds to both state and local governments, making Max Loeb's Memorial Park a possible recipient for some of those funds. The hope was then that any revenue made from this completed project, along with any contributions, donations, and endowments obtained, would be used to pay off that government money. That was a running thing in this project. Most of the funding was running on hope. At this time, the focus of the memorial aspect of the park was also narrowed. Early on, its focus was a little more vague, as it was said it would commemorate Oregon's prosperity and civic pride. Not that that wouldn't have been enough. But by 1934, the memorial element was focused more on those Oregonians who had served in past wars. And also by this time, again October, the model of the park had made its way north, where it was on display at the Multnomah Hotel. Months later, it would be moved to the Public Service Building, which, at the time, housed the offices of the Portland Gas and Coke Company. And a few more months down the road, it was put on display at the J.K. Gill store in their large building at 5th and Stark. It was said these displays always attracted large crowds and kept people excited about the possibilities of that hill overlooking the city. However, that did little to move the project forward. While the later 30s were arguably less arduous than the early 30s when it came to the Depression was still on, and this was going to be quite the undertaking. At almost $500,000 just for the roads, I can only imagine what the whole project would have cost to complete. Since planning would never reach an advanced stage, these figures were never determined. But it would have been a lot. Despite hopes of federal money, the progress on the Max Loeb Memorial Park faded out for a couple of years until, strangely, it was briefly revived in the summer of 1938. In a small article from the July 17, 1938 Sunday Oregonian, the notion of receiving federal funds was raised again. A.E. Desmarais, acting director of the National Park Service, had contacted Mr. Loeb personally, suggesting financial aid could be sought for the project, possibly from the Works Progress Administration or the Federal Administration of Public Works. But that was it. More hopes of money trickling down with nothing to follow. By this point, Max Loeb was in his late 70s and dealing with health problems, making it difficult for him to stay deeply involved with such a massive project. October 6, 1940, in another blip from a Sunday Oregonian, a Milton Baum, merchant from Tennessee, penned a letter to the Portland Chamber of Commerce expressing that such a park would be a major tourist attraction and would benefit local commercial interests. This letter came 5 years after Baum had visited the city and obviously learned of the project at that time. But by this time, it had been a decade since the idea was first revealed to the public, and little had been said about it since 1935. Also in 1940, Max Loeb would suffer a heart attack, leaving him hospitalized for weeks. He directed any inquiries on the park matter to be taken up with the Portland Planning Commission. He would end up hospitalized with a serious illness in 1941, and in the spring of 1942 he would move to a convalescent home due to his deteriorating health. He would pass away on May 5, 1944, at the age of 82, never seeing his dream become a reality. As the park plan faded off, in the coming years, roads not all too different from what were planned for the park would be run up into these hills, but not for a massive public gathering place, but for the residences that would be built up there. And that's what exists there today. So this is the end, as they exist today, of the park blocks, South Park blocks. Now they did used to go a couple blocks further down, but we have a freeway going through here today. So, they put some grass on the overpass. It's kind of park blocky, even though the grass is dead as all hell. But if you look at the model that was set, and I'm kind of using that as the primary guiding outline for this project, as I feel it was probably the closest thing to what it would have actually been. If you look at that, you realize that the planned outdoor theater venue would have just been a little ways up the hill. It would have been actually pretty close to, you know, the edge here that goes down into the freeway. Now, the model showed that like 1 block down from the park block, so like pretty much just the other side of this building, there would have been another street, and that street would have come in over there, and kind of right up here above all of that from here to here pretty much, the theater venue would have been like right there. It would have been just a little ways, like part way up the hill. Kind of, you can see there's like a house back there behind this building. Probably kind of would have been roughly where that is up there. And you can see like this place up here kind of poking out from behind this building. All the stuff that's just the other side of this building here, that would have been about where the theater venue would have been. And then the really long, large building they show, I mean, that would have stretched from up there, would have stretched all the way down there. It was going to be a pretty long structure. So there were a handful of little things related to this project that I want to at least show a few of them. A lot of things, you know, they would have existed in how they were going to build the roads in relation to that project, but since the project never happened, the roads that do exist up here, I mean, they're not all too different. They're switchbacks, you know, like you'd have to have meandering your way up a hill. But obviously, since the roads are not done exactly the way that they were outlined for this project, you have buildings existing in places you can't reach. It's all residential up there. So there's lots of things where it's like, oh, over there on the other side of that house there was something. Oh, you know, if I could climb up through that brush up this little hill over here, like there's something. But I'm just going to do the best I can to kind of show you certain areas in relation to this project where things generally, I can't even say generally would have been, but generally could have been. And I'm going to start right down and around the corner. Actually, a place I've been to once because it's tied to something else that I've covered. Here's where a lot of the climbing starts. So this area dead ahead I covered in my Dark Strangler video, because this is the general area where a woman named Blanche Myers was selling a house and was later found dead there and believed to be a victim of the Dark Strangler in the late 20s. But in our case, according to diagrams generally in line with this street, they would have cut kind of right up here, right where the road ends. They were going to cut a tunnel through there. A road is going to go under another road, and it was just going to connect with one of the many streets they were going to build going up into the hills here. But yeah, right here, there was a planned tunnel. My legs are already tired, but my thighs need this. So yeah, the non-existent tunnel right here. And then as we go up, and I'm not that far down from where I was when I showed where the theater could have been, so the outdoor theater was probably literally would have just been right up over here. Here is, I may pronounce some of these streets wrong, Cardinal, that's how it's spelled, Cardinal Way, Cardinal Way goes that way. This is Cardinal Drive, and this bordered along the east side of where this park was going to be. So theoretically, the border of the park would have been right up there, and the theater would have been just right up over there too. So we'd be kind of venturing up to the kind of northwestern part of the park if you keep wrapping up this street. But it would have all been right through here. And then of course further down that way, zigzagging up Cardinal Rivington It's the road I'm going to turn off here. And right about here, generally speaking, this would have kind of been the northwest kind of corner of where the park was. It wasn't perfectly, the borders weren't perfectly north, south, east, and west, especially on a hillside, but generally this would have been kind of where the northwest corner was. And not too far that way, there's actually, the ground starts to level off, and you have we return to kind of a grid-like system. But yeah, Rivington, this is right on the border of the park. And as we climb up here, we start going into the area where the really large is kind of an elongated structure that seemed to, over the years, replace the 3 towers. That would have cut through right up here, approximately. Again, we're going based on a model using street system that's similar to how the streets are up here, but it's not exact. And so as we continue to zigzag through here, up Rivington, I don't know how to say it any other way, we're still kind of straddling the north border of where the park would have been. And just for point of reference, I mean, you can get kind of a good feel for how high up we are. You look through there, you can kind of, through the trees, I guess not really, but some of the tall buildings in downtown, they're like peaking right there. So we're already at a pretty high elevation. And as we get to where Rivington meets Myrtle Court, which is near Myrtle Drive, that's where we run into the general approximate area where this really large, long building would have been. That probably would have still been the most attractive, gripping aspect of the whole park. And as we climb to the approximate site of where this large building would have been, you'd think something that big, the land would have been leveled off. And I'm just wondering, in relation to that 3-dimensional model they made, was the model of the hill itself, was it, how accurate of a representation was it in relation to how the hill actually is? Because we are coming to Myrtle Court here. And generally speaking, if you compare overhead view of the model to actual maps of this area now, this large building would have been kind of cutting through right here, and the land isn't exactly flat. So I'm wondering if maybe that was going to become another thorn in their side, was they were going to have to do a lot of leveling off of the land, because this ain't exactly flat. But with its steep dropping right over here, I think the building would have been just right up in here, kind of stretching off more that way as opposed to that way, where literally there's an edge right up here. So this is, I checked to make sure, Myrtle Court would have been going off the other way, so we're still on Rivington, which I'm going to stay on because I have to, the next road I want to get to is really close to this one, but there's no direct way to get there from here without having to continue down Rivington. Because here's Myrtle Drive. So yeah, the large building would have been cutting through a lot of this that you see right here. Myrtle Drive goes up that way, but that kind of doesn't go the way I want to go. And you can see, beautiful view that way, but an eventual drop off. And now we're just surging downhill. As I come back down, I'm actually getting really close to Peugeot's castle, which makes me think the building may have been more running over here as opposed to down this way, so maybe a little bit more angled. But still, I mean, there's not a lot of flat land up here. It levels off in parts, but it's not really that flat. I just really wonder what their plan was. And it's implied they wanted to do it at the top of the hill, so you know, again, this never really got past the early planning stages. I'm sure questions of this nature would have come up. There would have been survey work done. They would have been, you know, they probably would have had to make a topography, that's the word I was trying to think of, like a, you know, a map that shows like how the elevations change all through here, and they would adjust accordingly. So yeah, I mean, that said, even the model that they created, I feel like that was cool, but I feel like that was done without taking a lot of that into consideration. I think there was just a lot of like, look at this, it's gonna be beautiful, we're gonna make it happen, and Portland's gonna be gorgeous, and we're gonna have this massive monument to the state up on the hill. Nothing can go wrong. And speaking of monument, now that I'm here, right around the corner from this tree, hello, Peugeot's castle. We meet again. I didn't even really necessarily think I was gonna pass by here. I didn't realize that Rivington kind of wraps down and becomes Buckingham, and Buckingham is where the castle is located. That's cool. Just gotta take a moment to pay some respects. I don't know, there's somebody working in the garage. Because I know this place was up for sale recently, but I haven't checked to see like if it's actually been bought by somebody. Because you know, you do got, I mean, not as much as there used to be because there's trees here. This used to be a prime place. People would go up by the tower and take photographs of the city because you had this kind of unobstructed view. Which again shows you, even though I just went downhill a bit, I'm still pretty high up in the hills. And I feel like the building in question that I've been talking about would have been above, it had to have been above and behind Peugeot's castle, if anything, because I mean, they weren't gonna build it down there. So, anyway, good to see ya. But I've got another adventure at hand. So I'm trying to get to Davenport Street. Or is it street or drive? Davenport. I'm trying to find Davenport. I'm staying on Buckingham. I've gone up Buckingham before, obviously, to see Peugeot's castle, but I've never gone this way. And as we wrap up, right before Buckingham ends, you turn on to Davenport. So, and off this way, this kind of would have been the east end of the park. And so we're kind of getting more towards the area that would have been more towards the southeastern part of the whole thing. And I'm talking more the main park. Like, there were lots of roads zigzagging down the hill that would have been created in relation to the park. Anyway, Davenport Street, here we go. More hill climbing. Garbage men to evade. But, you know, those streets were built in relation, or would have been built in relation to the project, but I'm kind of considering a lot of those, especially as you go downhill, to be more outliers of the project. And so we'd be a pretty good ways into the southern portion of the park. Just right here, Davenport kind of runs through a portion of it, and some of that may have been where the planned zigzagging roads up the hill would have been, and a planned bridge. Anyway, we're climbing, and this street is unforgiving. As Davenport kind of starts to hook off this way, the park border more kind of goes off that way. So right through here where the road turns, this is where we start meandering outside of where the park border would have been. But it still would have been bordering us pretty close, just off to our right. So the road along Davenport Street is finally leveled off. The park, again, as it would have generally existed, would be off to our right a little bit. I don't want to pan to the right and just picture bombing people's homes, but right here where we have a little bit of the reprieve from the sun, this is Governor's Park. Again, land donated by former Oregon governor and mayor, or Portland mayor, Sylvester Penoyer. I've always wanted to come up here, and I finally have an excuse to do so. I've always just wondered what this is like, because it's kind of just this little thin park up here at the top of the hill, and it technically exists outside of the planned park parameters for the Max Loeb Park, but with that park, the park border is kind of just going off a little ways that way, and the park, Governor's Park, kind of zooming down there. This still would have been kind of bordering along the Max Loeb Park, and I think that was kind of an end game thing for Max himself. Was he wanted this big planned park to border up really close to Governor's Park. Governor's Park nature area, sensitive wildlife habitat. So maybe it's a good thing that it's kind of a pain to get up here on foot. It'll keep some of the people that want to mess with the wildlife out. Stay on the trails, dogs on a leash at all times, remove all waste. No dumping. That being said, is this a trail? Oh, it is. But it looks like it goes down pretty far. But this is then Governor's Park. Looks like it meanders there because the park just kind of goes off this way for a ways, and it also goes off that way a little bit. So I'm just showing a bit of the park, and also, I mean, it's a decent view. Like right over here would have been the Max Loeb Memorial Park. It would have been just all right through here. And if you look far enough past it, like through here, you can kind of see the buildings of downtown. And it would have just gone off, you know, just would have been down through here, just up against the park. And I just climbed a lot. I was up there just a second ago, and I came literally from, you know, down, I mean, there's the city. I was way down there, as low as you can go. So if I'm gonna explore this park a little bit more, and however you want to shake it, like this park is very critical to the overall story, because if you read between the lines, you can see Max Loeb back in 1925 getting all up in the city's face about not taking better care of its parks, but more specifically not being grateful for the gifts that have been given to the city by people. But so many gifts of land, what have you, had been given. And his whole reason for getting in the city's face in 1925 was in relation to John Vestal recently passing away and leaving his estate to the school district. But he used that as an excuse to reference back to this space that had already been existing for so long. And it's kind of like, of all the different things that have been left to the city and its people by prominent individuals since 1894, why did Max Loeb specifically reach back and focus on this particular park? And I don't think it's a coincidence that a few years on down the road, he makes this big announcement that he wants to build this massive, elaborate memorial park, and it's literally right here, butting up against Governor Park. I keep calling it singular, Governor's Park. So the fact that he was taking such an interest in this particular spot, about 5 years before he suddenly announces to the world that he wants to build this memorial park, I do not think that that is just a coincidence. I think this idea had been brewing in his mind for a long time, and he was definitely having thoughts back into the 1920s about what could possibly be done with all of this land out here that's mostly residential now, but back then was mostly undeveloped. And then, of course, from Governor Park, Davenport here keeps veering off more away from where the memorial park would have been off this way. Now, while I'm a ways off from where the park would have been, actually it would have been behind me, I'm walking away from it. Here's where Davenport comes down and connects with Broadway Drive, which wraps around, stays with Broadway, and then you go far enough down that way, it runs really close to Terwilliger. And that plays a part in this project too, because those were kind of the easternmost borders just below where this planned park would have been. So I want to get there, but the place I want to get to is a little bit difficult to get to, because if I just go down Broadway, I got to go down a really long ways, and I got to wrap all the way around to Terwilliger and then wrap all the way back up this way. But I can avoid all of that by taking a bit of a shortcut. Well, hello, beautiful. Into this trail, and I'm in the Markham Nature Park, which I take this trail right down to where the main entrance is, and I'm right by where I need to be. And just like that, I am on the other side of the Markham Nature Park, and this is where Sam Jackson Park Road here merges into Terwilliger, right at that intersection. And just my side of that intersection, there was a planned bridge. It's pretty detailed on the planned model. So pretty much right where like this van's pulling into this Shell station. That's about where the bridge would have crossed. I guess it would have come from that hill and crossed over up to that hill right up there. So the model, and again, I don't know if the model was to scale, but the model kind of implied, it doesn't really look in the model like it was that high up of a bridge, but if you go from ground level down here and you look up to where the land level's off, like it's pretty high up there. And yeah, it would have been, because Terwilliger right there just wraps around and goes back another way. What the hell have we got here? So yeah, and it would have just been this side of that intersection. So it would have started right up there, crossed right over here, and merged right about there. And that would have led people into the park. And in a later report, they said that the main entrance to the park was going to be on the south side of it. And we are to the south side of where that park would have been. So I'm wondering if that bridge would have served as a primary access point to lead people into the park from the south. But yeah, this is where it would have been. Towering above us and towering over the Shell station. I'd have been more or less walking right under it. It's just so cool to think about what wasn't here. It's a nice reflection, but you can reflect on it without worrying about it actually happening and the negatives that may have happened with that. From the Lilac Garden, you can see there's one of the buildings from OHSU, which is right up here. So, you know, I like to think in a certain world where this project happened and things hadn't changed, you could go to the hospital, deal with your stressful hospital stuff, then venture down, cross the bridge, and then go into the Memorial Park and just kind of hang out and unwind for the rest of the day in an ideal world. And the park would have continued going off this way, which makes sense because there's a big hill right here. It would have had to. And this is the street that Mel Blanc lived on. Mel Blanc lived right over here. So, yeah, his house would have been just downhill from where the this big thing would have been. That would have what he would have had to look up to. Wait, I don't even remember when Mel Blanc. I think he probably would have been before this project. So I don't. Anyway, in a world where time doesn't matter, Mel Blanc could have stepped out on his front porch, looked up, and there would have been this big memorial park up there. Understanding why this project never happened is not too difficult to understand based on the known details. I feel it really comes down to 3 things, all of which tie back into financing. that was really the greatest obstacle. First and most obvious, the timing was just bad on this one. Max Loeb revealed his vision to the world just a few months after the stock market crashed. With the passage of time, people's financial struggles were only getting worse, and the peak time of this project's popularity just happened to run in line with the worst period of the Great Depression. This ties into the second reason I feel this project never happened, which was Max Loeb's clear presumption that funding this whole thing would be relatively easy. He presumed people all over town would willingly make contributions in the early going, while also presuming the more wealthy people would get involved later on. It would all be through donations and endowments. This was all presumption with no definite outline of how much money would be raised and how quickly. Consequentially, funding would remain a problem for the duration of this project. Not only did most locals not have a lot of money to throw around, but the city was struggling as well, and they had to focus on funding the things that were needed before investing money on something really cool looking. But not absolutely necessary. This might at least partially explain why there were multiple efforts to get the state and federal government involved. And while numerous times it was stated, at least into 1932, that Loeb held the options on these properties, they were only the ones owned by the city. And even then, there were instances during this time where he asked to have options on the land. So that detail is a little muddled, but it would make sense if he did, with the city holding on to this land specifically for him. And he was a well-respected real estate man. And that's the third issue, was the land itself. The city had other offers for this land that they were holding back, so they knew they could sell it off at a good price. And there are some details that remain unknown because, as far as I could gather, they were never reported on. While the city was fully prepared to move on and put these properties up for sale by the spring of 1932, the project remained a subject for discussion for several more years. It's unlikely the city held back these properties that long, but had these properties been sold off to those who intended to build there, it would have made achieving this project substantially more difficult. Furthermore, the oldest homes standing on the land where this park would have been, with few exceptions, weren't built until the 1950s. And even this view from 1937, with an early OHSU in the foreground, we can see the land beyond it still barely developed. So perhaps it was still feasible, regardless who had control of what lot, even by the end of the 30s, to think this project could have happened. Had the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, been established just a little earlier, it's very possible they could have funded much of this work, as doing park work was right in their wheelhouse. But the WPA was not established until 1935, and while it was suggested at one point that WPA funds could be used to help build this park, it really appears that even by 1935, this park was becoming one of those nuisances that the city would assume go away. And perhaps, had such a project been pursued years earlier, during the time in which some of those other never-happened projects I've discussed were pursued, it may have had better luck. Most of those hit their peaks between 1905 and 1915, at a time where the city was booming and people were excited about the next big thing. But the people just didn't want to be taxed more, which is what killed a lot of these ideas. Perhaps then Max Loeb's idea about taking contributions instead of taxing the whole populace might have been more successful, and certainly everything would have been a bit more affordable back then as well. In that age of grandiose excitement, a massive memorial park up in the undeveloped hills overlooking the city very well might have happened. But instead, it came about a generation later with the city still growing but coming to terms with the fact that it wasn't going to hit 2 million people anytime soon, and an economy that was anything but booming. And what if it had been built? Considering the economic constraints of the time, I look at this project and get the feeling that, had it been made, it would have been a scaled-back version of what was desired. A few less buildings, taking up a little less acreage. It wouldn't have been as captivating. And I also get the feeling that this park would not have lasted all that long. Sure, it would have been the creation of the year when it first opened, but with how the area it would have been in has developed, along with what has developed around it, I wonder if this park would have become another one of those cool things, sticks around for a while, and then succumbs to things such as money. That's some high-cost property up in those hills, and I think inevitably it would have become more or less what it is now, residences. That's just my take. Perhaps it would have succeeded, or perhaps a portion of it would have been kept around with residences built around it. I still don't think it would have been long for this world, had it actually happened. But that's just my gut feeling. We'll obviously never know for certain.